start. Thank you for attending another Quibuka Café Littéraire. This one is in English, of course. Today, the discussion will be about genocide perpetrators and their accomplices with you, Dr. Andrew Wallis. I'm gonna share your biography for those who don't know you, especially because we will be sharing this discussion on Quibuka website, YouTube. So Andrew Wallis is an academic, author, and journalist. He gained his doctorate from the University of Cambridge, where he taught the history of the Great Lakes. He is the author of 2 books on the genocide against the Tutsi, Silent Accomplice, the untold story of the role of France in the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, and Steeped in Blood, Akazu and the Architects of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. He has written for a wide range of UK and worldwide publications, including The Times, The Guardian, USA Today, thisworld.org, CS Monitor, OpenDemocracy.net, The New Times, and Rwandan, Ugandan, and South African radio and television. He is an expert analyst on Great Lake issues. More recently, he founded a new online website, we're going to talk about that later, and resource that campaigns for justice for the victims of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. The name of the website is Rwanda Justice for Genocide .org.uk. So, dear Andrew Wallis, why did you choose to write a book about the Akazu? And what was the process and difficulties you came across in writing a book on such a controversial subject?
First, can people hear me? Yes. Brilliant. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. It's been a few years since either book came out, but I like to think it's even more relevant today. What is inside those books. So I'm going to talk really about Akazu, and what surprised me, I think, when I did the first book, which is about the role of France, the complicity of France in the genocide, was I was coming across these figures, such as Agathe Habyarimana and her brothers and her family and these military figures, and yet there didn't seem to be much information out there. You could Google them, of course. You could read Alison Deforge's book or Rakia Omar's. But really, what did we know about them? What did we know about why, when they grew up as children, they never probably thought they were going to end up responsible for the murder of 1 million Tutsis in this country? What made them mass murderers? How did they get involved? And then I sort of decided, well, this in itself was a very important subject because, after all, you would probably agree, if you have no perpetrator, you have no crime. And this is, of course, today so relevant when we have genocide denial rising rapidly, certainly in the West. People say, well, we don't know who these were. You know, we've never heard of Bagosora, we've never heard of Zerera, Zengiumva. And so, you know, if you can't point out who did it, well, clearly there was nothing they did. So I think it's very important to put names to faces. And then you put a name and a face and a background and a motivation and a reason. Because they always say, you know, there's a motivation for a crime. You don't go out one day and commit a genocide. And the important thing about the Akazu, I suppose the most important thing I took away, is this was a crime that took years in preparation. This was not spontaneous, as they said. during the genocide when they're already making their excuses. This was a crime that, to understand, you had to go back to 1973 when these guys took power. And in fact, you have to go back further into the early 60s. And in fact, if you want to go back even further, you can go all the way back to 1894, 1896. And you see history repeating. The coup in 1896 is repeated in 1973, is repeated in 1994. It's the same actors. Kanjagira, the fabled queen who murdered her own stepson in order to get her son in power. Well, fast forward 100 years, you have Agat, Abiramana, and her brother Zed. So history is repeating. In 1963, as we know, there was genocidal pogroms here. Belgium supported the government. The international community looked the other way. The church looked the other way. 30 years on, what do we have? Exactly the same. History repeats itself. So for those, and I'm a historian, so I'm biased, but I would say history tells us about the present and the future, because it does repeat, because we don't learn from it. And it is a fool, I think, and all of us are fools at times, because we just sleepwalk into these events. So let me just say something very briefly about putting the book together, because you will see a very big book. And I was just saying to Ali here, I cannot believe I actually wrote this enormous thing. And if it makes you feel any better, it was double this size before I started editing it. So there's about 10 chapters which I had to leave out because my publisher refused to get involved. It was an enormous undertaking, because when you go into looking at history, you have to persuade people to talk. You have to persuade witnesses, and some of them are perpetrators, and some of them are survivors who both have good reason not to talk. Some of them are politicians, and as we know, politicians hate talking, especially if they're involved in something. Or military, they don't want to talk either. Or judges, or lawyers, client confidentiality. So there's a million reasons people didn't want to talk to me. Trying to persuade them was very tricky, and I'm so grateful to see some individuals here who helped me on this road to persuading, which was so important. So the road was a long one. I spent a fair amount of time going backwards and forwards to the ICTR and sitting in on trials and verdicts and speaking to lawyers there, sitting in courts in France, in the Magistrates' Court in London, here in Kigali, trying to talk to perpetrators in prisons around the country, trying to sit in archives. If anyone's ever sat in an archive, they know what a proposition it is. You're not quite sure, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. Maybe after a whole week, you've just got one sentence in a book. You found one fact that's relevant. You're paging through thousands of pages of dusty old documents. A lot of them in this country, sadly, had not been looked after, had been lost. People didn't really know what was there. It's not like a Google search. You put in a search term and up pops perpetrator, he did this. You've got to delve through boxes of papers, and you might strike lucky. And that might lead you on to the next archive, the next source. And then, of course, if you go to Arusha and you're trying to deal with the archives of the International Court, that's a whole other game. They've got all the facts and the figures. It's just they don't like showing them to anyone. So you get big sheets of paper and they've just put black lines through all the names for data protection. Or they say, this police report is off limits. You can't see that. Or that judgment is off limits. That's only for lawyers. So it's like they don't actually have the item, which is also very frustrating. So the archives is an issue. Obviously, for the genocide in 1994, there is very little audio or visual. The TV of the world media was not here. It was in South Africa with Nelson Mandela, or it was in America following the O.J. Simpson trial. Sadly, the genocide against Tutsi was not significant enough as a world event for anyone to come here and actually spend some media time and coverage. It was only the camps in July, when the refugees fled into the camps, that was suddenly big television, and the world media got interested. So that was an issue. So what you're trying to do with the book, and I tried to do, whether it's successful or not, those who read it can tell me, is not to write a very dull, long history of Rwanda, but to fill it with stories, because what I wanted to do was to follow these figures, Agathe and her brothers, and all these sort of mafia group around the Akazu, and to follow them through their school days, to follow them when they came into power in 73. And 1973, it's like they won the lottery. Suddenly these people with, Zed was a pretty much a failed secondary school teacher. Suddenly he's thrust into being prefect of Kibuye and then Ruhengeri. You've won the lottery. You've gone from nowhere to somewhere to someone. So that's the question for me, is following these characters through, but building their lives up through stories and trying to understand where they got to in 94, and then continuing the story, not stopping in 94 as a lot of books do, as if it's done and dusted. The genocide stops in 94, but to continue to follow them. Where are they today? Because that's what we want to know. That's what I want to know. What's the end of the story? And of course, some are in prison. Some are living happy retirements in France and in Belgium and places. So there's a life story. We all have life stories. This is the life story of the people who carried out the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi.
And can you explain a little about Akazu, who and what it was, and also its importance?
Okay, I've probably said a little bit about it already. Let's go back then. Yeah. How would I say, and I know there's people here who know a lot more than me about Akazu, but I always think of it as a small mafia, which grew into a very large mafia. And imagine a mafia group running your country. Rwanda became really two governments. There was the official government, which was the one the international bodies saw, the World Bank saw, the President of America saw, the President of France saw. All handshakes and Armani suits. And then there was this parallel network, this mafia group. The same figures, but this time they were working not for the good of the Rwandan people. This time they were working purely for their own wealth and power. And it was built around this small family group. As we say, Akazu literally is a little house. Some would also call it Le Clan de Madame, meaning Agathe Habirimana, the clan of hers, her family. Christophe Mfizi has also called it Network Zero, with Z in zero standing for Zigiriyezu, Musha Z, the brother of Agathe. So it's been called different names, and it was not actually termed Akazu until the late 80s. But it was already in the early 90s, if you would use the word Akazu here, you were in trouble. It was known what you were talking about, and certainly it was a term that these individuals didn't like. But the important thing was it covered every part of Rwandan society. I mean, can you imagine that? The church leaders appointed by these people, the business people with any power appointed by these people, the prefets, the burgmeisters, the cell leaders. all the way down through every part of society, administration, the military. If you wanted to almost any business, you had to have an Akazu figure at some level who was your benefactor. If you wanted to get anywhere. So it meant if you were from the south, or if you were a Tutsi, your chances of getting on in society were pretty small. If you were from Gisenyi, Bushiru, where this presidential family came from, your chances of getting on are really quite good, because you almost certainly you knew these figures. So it did mean that society became hugely divided. And how good a society is that going to be when certain people, certain players are completely dismissed just because where they come from, the regionalist element, which is not known about very much or talked about, or obviously for Tutsis up until 1990, really, they were invisible. It was almost impossible to get to university, almost impossible to get a good education, because you were pushed over. Those places always went to those, usually from the north, who had these contacts. So Akazu took power in 1973, I would say. Well, I say Akazu. It wasn't Akazu then, it was just Habyarimana. It was a so-called bloodless coup. That was how it was sold to the international community. He seized power. Within 2 or 3 years, the previous government had disappeared. And I mean disappeared. Most of them had disappeared into Ruangeri prison, never to be seen again. The former president had disappeared into his house in Gitarama. He's buried in the garden there, along with his wife, both murdered. So this bloodless coup, in fact, was extremely bloody. It was just done behind the scenes. The international community knew about it, turned the other way. The church knew about it, turned the other way, which unfortunately we see time and again. In fact, within just 7 years, by 1980, there was a coup attempt against Habyarimana. He was getting so unpopular, the corruption was sort of out of control already. These Akazu had already angered so many people. However, Habyarimana got wind of this. The people who led the coup were, one fled, one was arrested, and it fizzled out. And then you get what I call the golden years of Akazu, 1980 to 1990. There was no resistance. They slowly took over society. They took over the church. A Tutsi bishop was made a bishop, or a Tutsi was made a bishop, and then he was unmade it when they found out what his ethnic background was. And the Vatican went along with this. It's quite remarkable. So really they had their own way in everything. There was one possible leadership contender, a man called Colonel Mayuya, who was one of the few very upright, good, solid, professional soldiers in an otherwise very corrupt army. Sadly, he too was murdered in 1988 by Akazu because they saw him as a threat to their power. So in 1990, suddenly these golden years come to an abrupt end. The economy dives. The RPF invade. Multi-party power sharing comes. And Akazu really, for the first time, they're thrown back. Agat has to decide what is going on here. Our power is really threatened. And the next 3 or 4 years are marked by genocidal pogroms. As we know, the genocide to me does not start in 1994. You talk to victims at Bugesera or Kibalira or the other sites where genocide took place in 1990, 91, 92, 93. And they're often forgotten. These crimes, sadly, were never investigated. The international community issued a report saying they'd happened, but there was no investigation. Akazu got away with those, and they were really the start. They set the scene. And then, as we know, what happened in 1994. And interestingly, some Akazu stayed here and took part. Some fled abroad, where they continued to support. And in the years following, we saw immediately after, a lot of them went to neighboring countries where they attempted to build up a new power base and to use this army the French had allowed to go into Zaire without disarming it. And certainly if you were living here, as some may have done, in late 1994, 95, we sit here now as it's one of the what-ifs of history, but we just assume the RPF won. We assumed that the new government was going to stay in power. Well, if you were here in late 94, 95, that was certainly not a done deal, because on the border, if you can imagine on the border of your country, you've got 40,000 heavily armed men. They've got Colonel Gaddafi of Libya arming them. They've got Omar Bongo Gabon arming them. They've got arms coming in from Zaire. So the ex-Rwandan military of Bagasora, Bizimungu, were in those camps fully intent on coming back in here. There were genocidal attacks back into the country in 1994, 95, 96. So it was a very close-run thing, I think, that we are sitting here today not in a state of post-genocide horror, then we're sitting today safe and secure and looking forward. But obviously moving forward there, where do Akazu go? Well, a lot of them went to big houses in Nairobi, Agat and Zed and Kabuga. You know, they took all the money they stole from this country, which was most of it, and they set up life in exile. A lot of them went to Cameroon, West Africa, and enjoyed good lives for a time. The International Court was set up in Arusha, and slowly arrests started to be made, and at which point a lot of them decided they were safer in Europe, where human rights laws protected them, good lawyers protected them, apathy or politics, in the case of France and Belgium, protected them, or coming to the UK will come on later, where we never take action against anyone who has committed genocide, so that obviously protects you as well. So you get impunity. So there we are. That's a brief overview of Akazu, the rise and the fall of this group. But I think it's hugely important that they are not forgotten, because in forgetting them, we forget the crime that they took part, or they made happen, really. So that's a long answer to a short question, sorry.
It's not that long. We will go back to that, because let's not forget youth is watching also, and we have to really explain how they were organized. Why are trials for genocide and war crimes still so important today?
Trials. Okay, this is one of my bugbears, having attended a lot of them. ICTR trials especially. One of my issues, one of the sort of the worst days of your life, if you can imagine attending a judgment in Arusha. And if you went to the war crime, I don't know, has anyone here been to ICTR or attended? Brilliant. Well, you know, there you go. I've got a fan club at the back there. Tremendous. Tom was there several times. Brilliant. Well, did you attend any judgments? No, verdicts. Oh, you missed. Okay, judgments. So picture the scene, and I'll show you a little clip in a minute, if we can get this to work. There you are. You've got, for the sake of asking, who should we have in the dock? Well, let's have Bagasora. We all know Bagasora, the architect of it all, and his sort of friend in evil, Anatole Zengyumva, the so-called butcher of Gisenyi, who managed to clear the whole Gisenyi region of Tutsis quickest. It's a claim to fame. So they're sitting in the dock. In the public gallery, which is a sort of corridor almost, with a glass compartment, so you can look into the court, you can see them, they can see you, but there's no hearing, obviously. And you wear your little earpieces so you can hear what's going on. I'm sitting there, and all the places to the left, there's about 10, 15, 20, are all supporters of Bagosora and Zengiumva. There's family members, there's previous accused who have managed to get out, get off, get reduced sentences, who are now free. Basically, it's a whole collection of Akazu and their supporters, giving a sort of power salute, you know, to the accused in the dock, and sort of whooping and getting excited when the verdicts came in, that they'd, in Zengiumva's case, had his verdict remarkably reduced from life to 15 years, and then freedom straight away because he'd served that already. Even he couldn't believe it. But it's one of those times where you think you must be in a parallel universe. You think, how is this possible? How is this justice here? And it took place 1,000 miles away in Arusha. So no one here saw it. It was not on television because the internet was so poor in the court. So no one knew about it. So justice was not seen, and justice, I would say, was denied. So overall, a pretty poor experience. And to make matters worse, well, I mean, I'll give you another little story. Too many stories, but here we go. I was given a tip-off one evening. I was told after another judgment, Justin Mugenzi, a particularly unpleasant individual who murdered his first wife, and that was back in the late 70s, before he got on to what he did during the genocide. And Prosper Mugenzi, thank you, who was another minister. They had both had 30-year trial sentences overturned on appeal, released by a particularly controversial judge who tended to release a lot on appeal, Theodore Meron. I was given a tip-off. They were having a celebratory party, and I actually put this story in the book, but I'll just recount it because it's one of those, another surreal moment in life. So I went along to this sort of cafe bar in downtown Arusha, playing the card of being a sort of stupid and rather ignorant British backpacker, something a role I'm quite good at. So I sat there and watched while the room filled up with Zed and Zengiumva and all these other guys who had been released on appeal or sentences had finished or whatever. And then at about 10 o'clock, 10:30, in came the successful duo. Mugenzi marched in, big smile on his face. The defense attorneys marched in. They put on Queen's We Are the Champions. There was champagne all round. It was just like a sort of celebration. If you can think of all the defendants at Nuremberg having a party, having got released, that's what it felt like. And you're sort of sitting in there thinking, what is going on here? This is international justice. And hearing these victory celebrations with Mugenzi saying, what is this? What is this so-called genocide of the Tutsis? There was no genocide. The Hutus never carried out any genocide. This is rubbish. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, really, this is international justice? This is what we paid $3 billion for? $3 billion for this? As a survivor said to me at Nyanza, he said, why didn't you just give us the $3 million, us survivors? Because really, you know, what have we achieved? So, but having given you that, let me give you another part of justice and trials and why I'm actually very keen on them, because I think, especially today, with denial going ballistic in the world, it's so important that we have these accused, again, names and faces. They're in the dock, you can see them. And more important, it gives the survivors a chance to look them in the eye and to say, you were the one who raped me. You were the one who killed my family. And that is so important. And even more important is that is then archived. That is on camera. That is written down forever. It is so difficult to deny a crime once it's been in a court and it's gone through that legal process of defense. It's been properly looked at. It's not someone's opinion. Lawyers of both sides have looked through it and a judgment has been given. So I think in terms of denial, it's so important these guys, even today, even as they're getting old, go on trial. Some would know Felician Kabuga, the so-called financier of the genocide, the head of RTLM radio. He was finally found, as we know, in the middle of Paris, where he'd been living for several years. He was finally put on trial, and then late last year in August, halfway through, well, probably a third of the way through the trial, it was called off. His doctors argued he had dementia, and therefore it was unfair, he couldn't understand proceedings, and therefore he should be released. And the trial stopped, and that is what happened. That to me is really sad, but on the positive side, we do have some trial transcripts of the first half of the trial. We do have the site of Kabuga in the dock, so at least it's something. And we also have the world's press, just for a change, just for a few seconds, concentrate not on denial, which they spew out every day, but they actually talk about a perpetrator on trial, and that's really important to focus the world media if they can see these people. Because I think, to me, that's what the ICTR got really wrong, is no one saw these trials. Rwandans couldn't see it because it wasn't in their country. The international community couldn't see it because there was such poor internet and media that, unlike the ICTY in The Hague, judging the Bosnian war, that was all one click away. You could watch that. You could watch the proceedings against Milosevic, but you couldn't see the proceedings against Bagosora. And so they've been lost to history, and their crimes have been lost. So trials are important, and they must, I think, keep going. I mean, Germany has recently put a 103-year-old man on trial. Now, you might say, it's 103 years old, really? Really, does that really help justice, putting a 103-year-old man on trial? But I would argue, yes, it does, because it's not about him. It's about a much wider issue going forward. When this man is being judged, guilty or not guilty, going forward another generation, people can look back and they can read about everything that went on, which the trial will throw up. All the witnesses will talk about not just what he did, but about, how Auschwitz worked. Much wider issues. So for me, it's about the person, but it's about the crime, and we shouldn't forget that. So it's one reason, as we'll probably say with the next bit, which is probably around the failure of the UK, why trials are something that we need to be pushing our governments to keep happening, even if they're old, even if the alleged perpetrator is an old man, and they are old men now. And sadly they are dying. In the case of Kabuga, he was got off before because of dementia. In France, for example, we had the case of the prefet of Gikongoro, Lucien Brucia-Bruta. We waited more than 2 decades to get him on trial in Paris. Finally, we got him on trial. Finally, he was convicted of genocide. And then within a week, he was released because they said he was too old and prison wasn't the right place for him. And about a year later, he died. So justice again was delayed, and justice again was, sadly, I think, denied. I mean, it's good that he was on trial. It was good that he had to look survivors in the face. And it's good that there's a huge amount of new information came out because of that trial. But in terms of that particular case, it shows we're fighting every day that goes past now. And these Akazu are not on trial, to me, is one day too many. These cases are taking 10 years, 20 years to come to court. Then the court cases are taking forever. So, sadly, a lot of Nazi perpetrators died in their beds. And the way we're going, the same is going to be true in Rwanda. So we need to keep pushing, keep pressing our individual ministers, politicians, that this is what we need. At least, that is my opinion.
And you're right, because I saw myself, Félicien Kaboga, entering the Paris courts, his fist in the air. He wasn't scared at all. Thank you. So my next and final question before the Q&As. You have recently set up a new campaign website that aims to keep the world updated on the international trials, justice, and the genocide against the Tutsi, and especially the failure of the United Kingdom to bring 5 suspects there to justice. Can you explain a little bit about what you hope to achieve and why justice is still being denied?
Okay, thank you. This is one of my latest sort of post-book projects, really, if it's a project. You may or may not know, is anyone here from the UK? Is it just me? I feel I'm the lone Brit. I feel like Brexit has taken place. Yes, wonderful, wonderful. Don't be afraid to put your hand up. I know it's embarrassing saying you're British, and most of the time I feel embarrassed about it, especially on this subject. But yeah, yes. No, it is a sad, sad state of affairs that of all the countries in the world, probably the UK is right up there with impunity. It's sort of, despite Boris Johnson saying that we take genocide very seriously, if you don't have a single genocide trial in 80 years, how serious do you think you're taking it? After the Second World War, the British government in 1947, 2 years after the war, we imported a whole regiment of Waffen-SS. That's 7,000 men to the UK because we needed coal miners. We were meant to screen them because we knew a lot of them had been involved in the Holocaust, but we didn't. 40 years later, it was pointed out to us by Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, that dozens of these individuals who were complicit in the murder of tens of thousands of Jews were living happy lives in the UK. And we didn't even have any laws to do anything about it. We then had 5 years to push through some war crimes legislation so we could do something. And at the end of all of that, most of these Nazis were now 80s or 90s, and most of them then died in their beds. We managed one trial. We didn't manage a single trial for genocide, but we managed one conviction for war crimes, and the individual himself died 4 years later because he was in his late 80s. Since then, that was 2000, in the past 24 years, guess what? Not a single trial. Does that mean the UK has not a single war criminal or genocide suspect in there? I think not. In fact, we have 5 Rwandans, genocide suspects. They came over in the late 90s, and they've been living fairly happily ever since. There was an attempt to extradite them, but the British government said this was not a safe country to send them to in terms of getting a proper trial. Interesting. However, there was then allegedly a police investigation, which I'm told is ongoing, and certain people in the room can probably tell you more about that, but it is ongoing. Will it lead to anything? Again, one of the men, the suspects, has had a stroke and is unwell, and I suspect his defense lawyer will say he's unfit. So every day that goes past is another day justice is delayed and denied. It's a sad state of affairs in the UK, and I do feel quite embarrassed sitting here at Kwabuka 30, you know, as a resident of the UK, knowing that my government just doesn't seem to see the crime of genocide as being important. If I commit a parking violation, I will be prosecuted. If my dog produces a lot of mess on the pavement, I will be prosecuted. If I commit genocide in another country, I will get impunity. What does that say about the politicians in charge of our country and our legal system? And yet, we will, of course, point the finger at all the other countries in the world and say, your justice system is not so good. Your trials are not fair. Your lawyers are not very good. The word hypocrisy does come to mind. You can judge yourselves whether that is one that is right and proper. But having said all of that, so I have a website which I might attempt to show you now. Please bear with me while we attempt to. Yeah, oh, that's, no, I may not be. Okay, bear with me while this happens. What's also important is trials going on around the world. So as you may know, in France, there was a conviction just before Christmas. In Brussels as well, just before Christmas. So slowly, these cases are taking place. But if you think of the amount of genocidaires still out there, it is very slow progress. And as I said, they are all getting old, and their excellent lawyers are using every trick in the book to stop them coming into the dock. The good news is when they do come in the dock, all of them are being convicted, which is saying something. It's remarkable. I'm not sure there's been a single individual in a European court who has not been convicted. Do you want to hold it? Is it connected to the internet? No. Oh, okay. Right, we just talk among yourselves for a second. Has anyone got any questions from any of what I've said so far while we're
Or any
our
comments?
web genius? Comments, questions? Have I stunned you all into silence? How about the ICT lobby at the back? Would you like to tell us all about your experience of ICTR? I'm sure you would. There must be some positivity there, which I'm desperate to feed into. Were you visiting or were you working? Just visiting? Just visiting Arusha, or were you just... ICTR tourist? Wow, that sounds like a lot of pain. You'd think you'd want to walk up Mount Kilimanjaro, but as a better thing to do. Tom, you are always good for a comment, so I'm going to hand the microphone to you, and you can make a comment, given that you are also responsible for this book. So,
thank you, Andrew. My voice is not very good. For those who have stepped in blood, the story he was telling me about Justin Mugenzi and denying the genocide is on page 557. Page 557. Whereby he say, if you see the quote, you understand why the choice of the music, We Are the Champions. their denial had succeeded to convince some people that what they are doing can be done away with impunity. Andrew, I think one of the members of Akazu, actually from the inner circle, who was tried in France is Pascal Simbikangwa. Simbikangwa was not someone who was so high in the rank, was a captain, but he had a lot of influence on Habyarimana. One good example is a letter he wrote to the president. Actually, it was a memo, a big memo, and it was used in his trial. I'm the one who gave it to them. Imagine someone who would recommend, you remove this minister, is corrupt, you should transfer this colonel to somewhere, take so-and-so to Russia, remove him from the ministry, and Simbikangwa was so powerful, and he managed, of course, to evade justice. He lived in a reunion for several years before he sneaked to France, and they got him there. The rest, I think, I would recommend this book because I think I read it 5 years ago. Yes, it was out 5 years ago. A book with, and the notes are more than 100 pages. I think it's from page 591 to 690 something. A lot of details, a lot of pictures, a lot of names. It's next to Death, Despair, and Defiance. If I would see books with details on the genocide, it's Steeped in Blood and Death, Despair, and Defiance.
Thank you, Tom. That's very kind. So this sort of says everything really for me. As I've just said, I believe the UK is now a haven for genocide. I think there's certainly over 800 suspected mass murderers now from all over the world.